Evening, everybody. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to speak to you. It's early in the morning here and late at the night there, so I suspect the time could be better for everybody, but that's unfortunately what has to happen when you are talking to people in this time zone. I'm just going to share my screen, which is not, hold on. Now, hopefully everyone's seeing the full slide. Yeah. Great. Okay. So I have been very fortunate to follow the negotiations for the BBNJ Agreement. I was actually on the New Zealand delegation for all of the IGC meetings, and so was there when the final agreement was adopted. Well, not adopted, but agreed. And so it's a real pleasure to talk about this treaty. One of the downsides of this treaty is it is actually rather long and rather complicated. So I will be focusing in on a few factors, but I did also want to give you a bit of an overview of the agreement as a whole. Hopefully everyone's familiar with the area beyond national jurisdiction. So we're talking here about the high seas and the deep seabed. And of course, the motivation for negotiating agreement is that current regulation of these areas is particularly fragmented, and the UNCLOS regime was inadequate in a number of ways, which led to the 4 elements of the package that were agreed for negotiations. The high seas covers almost 2/3 of the world's oceans, and so it is an incredibly important area. And we do know that biodiversity in the ocean, not just in the high seas, but also in coastal areas, is continuing to degrade over time. And there are a range of factors for that. Most of them are human-induced. So climate change is having a big impact, but also the pressure of use of the oceans and subsequent pollution and over-exploitation. Just to put it in the context, so this is often referred to as the 3rd implementing agreement under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is UNCLOS. And UNCLOS was concluded in 1982. In the early 90s, there were 2 other implementing agreements that were negotiated, one around the regulation of deep seabed mining, and the other on straddling in highly migratory fish stocks. And those were actually negotiated relatively quickly. But in contrast, the negotiations for the BBNJ agreement have taken a very long time. There was initially an ad hoc working group that was coordinated, organised by the General Assembly. And it wasn't until 2017 that the General Assembly finally authorised negotiations to start. And of course, the conclusion of the negotiations were in March last year. It was adopted in June, and we now have 2 ratifications of the agreement. So things are beginning to happen. So just, I know that you've had some introduction to the BBNJ agreement, but I just wanted to reorient you to some of the many acronyms that are used in this area, and I apologise if I use one, so let me know if I say something that doesn't make sense. But so we refer to biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction as BBNJ. And the agreement has a number of terms. Some call it the High Seas Treaty, some are calling it the BBNJ Agreement. That's the approach that I'm going to use here. And the instructions for the negotiations were to address 4 particular areas: marine genetic resources, including access and benefit sharing, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. There is a question, I think, about whether or not the agreement might be relevant to other issues that might come up in the future, but I'll talk a little bit about that as we go. And the other important aspect of the General Assembly resolution is the instruction that the process and its results should not undermine existing relevant legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional and sectoral bodies. And there has been a new acronym created for that, IFBs, referring to international frameworks and bodies. So if I use IFB, I'm referring to that part of the agreement. And as I said, the agreement was formally adopted in June 2023. The photo there is from the last few hours of the negotiations. Many people are now aware that the last day of the negotiations and the extended fifth session began at 9 a.m. on Friday and concluded at around 10 p.m. on Saturday. And that indicates the amount of negotiating and compromises that were trying to be reached at the very last minute. And so if you read the treaty and you see things that look slightly odd, and I'll talk about a couple of these, then this is the reason why there was a lot of changes and compromises at the last minute. So I'm going to start, before jumping into the actual text of the agreement, I just want to talk about a couple of different things. The first one is the debate over principles, and the principles were in play right up until the very last minute. So these were one of the key issues that were still being negotiated in the early hours of Friday and Saturday morning. So of course, one of them is the common heritage of mankind, and the debate arose because originally the proposal was to apply the principle of common heritage of mankind to genetic resources found in the deep seabed. But that has been a controversial idea. The agreement now addresses genetic resources found anywhere beyond national jurisdiction, but whether or not the common heritage of mankind would be explicitly included in the convention was a big question. It was very strongly pushed by the G77 in China and equally strongly resisted by many of the industrialized countries. The debate also raged around the type of benefits that might be shared from utilization of genetic resources and whether or not monetary or non-monetary benefits would be available to the developing world. But the big issue was, should common heritage be listed in the principles? And when you look at the general principles and approaches, you will see that the compromise is as follows. So the common heritage of humankind is included, but the key qualification of that is the final words, which is set out in the convention. And many of the developed countries considered that wording limited the application of common heritage because genetic resources are not covered in UNCLOS. In addition, there was the inclusion of the principle of freedom of marine scientific research, which was something that the developed world were very keen on, and then the principle of equity and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. I also should mention, I don't have a slide on this, sorry, given this is a group interested in environmental law, another of the really strong arguments over principles was around precaution. And so some were arguing very strongly that the principle should be the precautionary principle. That was primarily the European Union and the African group. And almost everyone else were saying the precautionary approach is fine. And so that debate then led to another principle being included, which said the precautionary principle or the precautionary approach as applicable. So it's a very unusual way to approach that, but nevertheless, through the convention, the agreement, as there is reference to the precautionary precaution, it's usually referred to as the precautionary approach. I'm happy to answer any questions about this if you've got an interest in that. So of course, the not undermining was an important aspect, and many states were very keen to make sure that that was very clear in the convention.
It is repeated in Article 5, although some argued you didn't need to repeat it, but it was actually included. I see someone's raised their hand. Joanna, would it be all right to respond to questions during the presentation?
Of course.
Yeah. So Edward, I think, did you have a question?
Yes, hi. I remember doing my thesis that my thesis supervisor, Eva, really remarked me like in law and every word is important. What would be for you like the difference between putting the precautionary approach or the precautionary principle here?
It's a
What
really
like
good
the
question.
consequences would be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's been a debate that has been ongoing in international environmental law. Generally, there has been reference to the precautionary approach in most international legal instruments. The resistance to calling it a principle has been the concern that calling it a principle might lead to it becoming binding on its own terms. So if you remember, the sources of international law under the International Court of Justice statute includes general principles. I can't remember the exact wording, but it does talk about general principles. And so those people who are concerned about it having a broader meaning prefer the approach in that it can be defined within the relevant contexts and not necessarily spread beyond that. So that's the reason for the debate. I should mention also that I think the precautionary principle does appear in some international environmental law instruments, but they are primarily ones that are EU dominated. So the OSPAR Convention, for example, I think refers to the precautionary principle, but that's just off the top of my head. Okay, so coming back to not undermining, so as I said, it was included there to just reinforce the instructions, but it also the following words, and it should be interpreted in a way that promotes coherence and coordination with those instruments, frameworks, and bodies. That is essentially an additional instruction. So it's not that. So the position of most parties was that those other international instruments need to be part of the discussion in terms of the activities under the convention, and they need to be brought in essentially and coordinated with. Where this not undermining really was quite crucial, and these are just a few of them, the fisheries activities and whether or not they would be subject to the agreement at all was a key discussion earlier in the negotiations. There was a draft text in the MGR section that would have excluded fishing altogether from the agreement. In the end, only fisheries activities, for fishing purposes are excluded. But if people are taking fish for genetic resources purposes, then they are covered by that part of the agreement. Another example of this was what happens if the Conference of the Parties decides to create an ABMT in a place where fisheries bodies operate. So what could the COP decide and what couldn't it decide? And I'll come back to that when we talk about ABMTs. And another one was to what activities should the environmental impact assessment apply, and in particular where activities are already regulated by other IFBs. So these were really key questions that were discussed to a great extent prior to the negotiation concluding. So for those of you who are familiar with multilateral environmental agreements, the institutions established by the agreement don't seem particularly foreign. There's a conference of the parties, a secretariat, although we don't know where the secretariat will be yet, a scientific and technical committee, a financial mechanism, an implementation and compliance committee. The clearinghouse mechanism as well is based on the CBD. But for law of the sea experts, this is a sort of a very new thing in many ways. And so But the advantage of having the sort of MEA type institutions was very clear, and most parties from the beginning were very clear that they wanted these. There are a few additional, there's an access and benefit sharing committee that is established to assist with MGRs, and capacity building and transfer of marine technology committee, which is intended to coordinate capacity building efforts. So it is a reasonably large organisation that's created by the agreement. So coming first to marine genetic resources, and of course the first question is, what does it cover? And this was, again, a huge amount of debate. There was a lot of argument that whether or not digital sequence information should be included, for example, or whether it should just apply to samples from areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the default is that it will apply to marine genetic resources and DSI after the entry into force. It can apply to those before entry into force, but a party can opt out when ratifying the agreement. So if a party does not make a specific opt-out, the provisions can apply to MGRs and DSI that are under their jurisdiction prior to the entry into force. And this was really because people were concerned about large libraries of samples that wouldn't be covered. As I mentioned, it doesn't apply to fishing and fishing-related activities, or organisms taken from fishing activities unless they are essentially being used for their genetic properties. And it applies to non-military government activities, but not military activities. So the clearinghouse mechanism has a really important role to play in these negotiations, in the running of the MGR section. So, for example, when a research trip is being planned, they are required to notify the clearinghouse mechanism in advance, and a batch identifier is created. So following the cruise, they then provide further information about where they got it and any results of the scientific research, and that is also uploaded to the clearinghouse mechanism. So the idea was that this batch identifier should be follow the use of any of these MGRs once it's been removed from the ocean, which allows us to know what sort of use the MGRs have been subject to following their collection. The clearinghouse mechanism also gets a whole range of other information, including utilisation, modalities for access, and how the products have been commercialised. And it also intends to facilitate access to traditional knowledge. And so Indigenous peoples and local communities can volunteer that they have this traditional knowledge and potentially be put in touch with researchers. And of course, also parties reporting. So the clearinghouse mechanism is in fact a really fundamental part of the MGR section. In terms of benefit sharing, the big issue, of course, was whether or not there would be monetary benefit sharing that could arise from the use of MGRs. The developing world were very strong about this, and this was another thing that kept people negotiating to the very last minute. So the non-monetary might be, for example, assisting build scientific capacity or other types of non-monetary benefit sharing. But what cracked or enabled us to get to consensus was a special fund that is being created. So waiting to rely on some sort of royalty system from products that might be developed many years down the track, and even that wasn't even able to be fully confirmed in the convention. So instead, there is this fund that is created under Article 52, where developed parties make contributions at 50% of their assessed contribution to the budget. And that's an ongoing obligation, and that reassured the developing world that there would be money
available immediately to assist with capacity building. And there is a process whereby the COP in the future can elaborate and expand modalities for sharing of monetary benefits. So, so this is really, I think, quite unusual and was an innovation of the negotiations. So moving on to area-based management tools, which is obviously something that everyone here is familiar with. There was a lot of talk about the 2030 targets. So the activity under the CBD has had quite a big impact on the debate. And often there was sort of questions about consistency with the CBD in a whole range of different ways, but it does create its own process. So an area-based management tool is a tool, well, both ABMTs and MPAs are defined there, but the difference being that the MPA will have biodiversity conservation objectives compared to area-based management tools. And we know, of course, that some sectoral organisations do have ABMTs or MPAs, but the idea, of course, is to try and increase the amount in the at the international level. So in terms of how this happens, there's a process for proposals, and this comes this can include information about a whole range of things, including what collaboration and consultation the state or states that are proposing the MPA have done. And that could be with other states, it could be with international bodies, or it could be with local stakeholders, scientific community, and Indigenous peoples. So even before you put the proposal in, I think there's a general expectation that there will be a certain level of cooperation and consultation before it's proposed. And then the proposal is sent to the scientific and technical body for a preliminary review. Once they've done that, consultations are opened to all relevant stakeholders, which is facilitated by the Secretariat. And again, there's a long list of potential relevant stakeholders, and I've already mentioned the main ones: states, IFBs, and Indigenous peoples and local communities, scientists, civil society. So I think it's interesting that this agreement as an international treaty does refer a lot to non-state actors, and again, I think we have the CBD experience to thank for that. The responses from the consultation are publicly available, and it's expected that the proponent will revise the proposal, which is again assessed by the scientific and technical body, and which then makes recommendations to the COP. So this is quite a lengthy process, and I do think that this process may lead to reasonably slow progress of proposals before they get to the COP. And then once they get to the COP, the question is whether or not the COP will adopt the proposal. And there are three potential options. First of all, the COP can take decisions on the establishment of area-based management tools. It may take decisions on measures compatible with those adopted by IFBs, or it may, where proposed measures are within the competences of other IFBs, make recommendations to parties to this who are party to the BBNJ and also party to those other agreements. Now, this was all very carefully negotiated, and I think that the A and C are reasonably clear. I think the question of what is a competence is going to be a key issue to decide whether something is within C or B. Because the question of obviously is, let's say there's a fisheries body and it regulates certain types of fish, but it doesn't regulate other types of fish. Could the COP establish measures for those other types, even though that RFMO could, if it wanted to, extend its regulation to those other fish? So I think there's going to be some really tricky technical questions about when something is compatible and when something is within the competence of other bodies. So, but the important thing, of course, is that there are no decisions that are binding where you fall into the category C, and that simply means the COP recommend and then the other body has the responsibility of deciding whether or not to accept those recommendations or do something else, or indeed do nothing at all. And I think this is a real challenge, and it's going to be a real challenge for the agreement. And I'm happy to come back and talk about that later as well. So in terms of decision making, one of the questions was whether or not it had to be made by consensus, and that was pushed very strongly by a few states. Others were not keen on consensus because of the possibility of one or two states holding up something where the rest of the international community has agreement on. And so what that meant was that we needed to include an objection process to ensure that states who are nervous about voting can be sure that their interests will be protected. But the objection process it tried to be confining. So a lot of this is based on the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Management Organization, which has a very narrow objection process. So if you do object, you have to say why, and one of the three reasons there, it's inconsistent with the agreement or UNCLOS, it discriminates against the party, or the party cannot practically comply. And there is also an instruction that, as far as possible, the objector should adopt equivalent alternative measures and not undermine the effectiveness of the decision. So there are lots and lots of constraints that have been tried to place around that, but there is no recourse to dispute settlement if states think that an objector is not complying with these provisions. So in the South Pacific Regional Fisheries Organization, you can actually have a dispute settlement process that's triggered if you disagree with an objection, or that obviously wasn't included in this. So it gives a lot of leeway to states who may not want to adopt an ABMT. So I'm conscious that time is moving on, so I'm sorry, I'm going to sort of whip through the rest of this. So environmental impact assessment, obviously there is an obligation to conduct environmental impact assessment in Article 206 of the Law of the Sea Convention. But there has been general agreement that hasn't been well implemented by states. And so an elaborated environmental impact assessment process was considered important to ensure that sufficient scrutiny is being done of activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. There was a big debate about whether it was activities or effects. So some argued that you should have to do the EIA if your activity, maybe in your own zone, might impact on the area beyond national jurisdiction. But so there is a kind of a sort of an acknowledgement of that issue. So if there's a likelihood that a state might cause substantial pollution or significant changes, which is the 206 standard, must conduct environmental impact assessment either under the agreement or consistent with national processes. And for those of you who are familiar with EIA, the consistent with national processes is the big hole in that one, because international law, and indeed many of the dispute settlement, has not gone a lot into what obligations there might be under national processes, and that information is provided to the clearinghouse mechanism. If there are a few situations where EIAs is not needed, if the impacts of the activity have been assessed under other bodies, and the assessment is equivalent to that in BBNJ, which as an aside, it's unlikely that they will be the same because it's quite a stringent process, or the regulations in those other bodies are designed to prevent, mitigate, or manage potential impacts below the BBNJ threshold. And that is a big, and that essentially will cover things like fishing, shipping, even activities in the seabed, because you can argue that they're being regulated to minimize impacts, and certainly minimize the significant impacts. And those other EIAs have to be notified to the clearinghouse mechanism. So in relation to EIAs, the big question was the threshold. So most wanted to use the significant threshold in Article 206, but others were really pushing for the threshold that's under the environmental protocol of the Antarctic Treaty, which is a minor or transitory effect. So essentially now there is a two-stage process. So the first question that states have to ask is, will the activity have more than a minor or transitory effect in the marine environment? Sorry, that should be impact on the marine environment. If yes, you then proceed to screening. And the screening information needs to be reported to the clearinghouse mechanisms. And that should allow potentially affected parties to express their views, and there's an opportunity for the scientific and technical body to make recommendations. If screening leads to the conclusion that there is a risk of, a reasonable ground for believing the activity may cause substantial pollution or significant and harmful changes, then there needs to be an EIA done. So there's a certain amount of scrutiny before you even get to the EIA. Again, consultation is really emphasised, and the proponent is meant to consider those comments and respond to the concerns. But the decision on the authorisation is made by the proponent state, and there had been proposals that it be the COP that makes that decision, but that was not able to be put through. And also, if states find through monitoring that there are unforeseen impacts, then there is a potential for review at that point. Finally, capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. Again, there is not a binding definite obligation here, which was what developing countries were wanting. So you see the words parties within their capabilities shall ensure capacity building, and within their capabilities is obviously up to the individual state to determine. And so there is no, there's an obligation, but it's so qualified that it doesn't lead to a lot of certainty for developing countries. And there is a lot of guidance about the types of capacity building and marine technology that could be included in this. And there is a CBTMT committee that will monitor and review that activity. As I mentioned, there is a financial mechanism. It goes a little bit beyond the funding mechanism that I mentioned relating to genetic resources, but there is a possibility of other funds, including through the Global Environmental Facility. I'm just going to move through that, sorry. And there is both the establishment of an implementation and compliance committee, which is limited to facilitative and non-punitive approaches. And then there is a lengthy dispute settlement process, which relies mostly on Part 15 of UNCLOS. So just very quickly, because I know time's running away with us, what about how might I evaluate this agreement? Well, I think that we can't underestimate the achievements that G77 and China made in this agreement. From the very early days, and I was actually present at some of the early ad hoc working groups where there was a complete lack of agreement about genetic resources and whether there was even any need for genetic resources to be covered. We now have an MGR regime that applies to all genetic resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is important given that the developed world wanted to stick with high seas freedoms. And the benefit sharing and potential monetary benefit sharing is in there. And it's due to the dogged determination of the developing world. There are strong but qualified commitments to capacity building, and there is essentially a lot of commitment to immediate financial contributions through the GEF and assessed means. The scientific and technical body is going to have a huge agenda, but one of its features is that in certain circumstances it can provide assistance where member states don't have capacity, and it will continue to develop guidelines for how the various principles will be implemented. The inclusion of common heritage of mankind, and as well as inclusion of references to traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So where are we at? Well, as I said, we've got 2 ratifications already, and it requires 60 ratifications to enter into force. I expect that we will see a relatively quick entry into force within, say, 3 years maybe. And the reason for that is that there is a lot to like in this agreement for the developing world. And of course, you could easily get 60 developing countries to bring it into force. The real question, I think, is whether key developed countries are going to ratify. That's important for financing. It's important to make sure that activities such as genetic resources utilization come under the convention. And it's also important for the relationship with fishing and other activities. So there is currently a huge effort underway. Lots of NGOs are really pushing and trying to help states get to the point of bringing their agreement into force. So I'm going to stop there, and apologies for sort of zooming through that rather quickly, but hopefully there'll be things in there that people want to ask questions about, so we can continue the conversation.